Hi there, I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to explore something that shaped centuries of history quietly and powerfully, a group whose name has been whispered behind closed doors, written into conspiracy theories, and embedded in the foundations of power across continents. This is the story of the Jesuits, their hidden influence, their secret operations, and the ways they've affected politics, religion, education, and even the fate of empires. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Share it in the comments below. It's always interesting to see where and when people are tuning in from. The Society of Jesus, more widely known as the Jesuits, was founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish soldier turned mystic. At first glance, they were just another religious order in the Catholic Church, one of many during the time of the Counter-Reformation. But the Jesuits were different from the start. Their mission was not just to pray and serve, it was to infiltrate, educate, convert, and influence. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but also a unique fourth vow: loyalty to the Pope above all else. This gave them a kind of freedom that most religious orders didn't have. They became the Pope's special agents, missionaries, educators, confessors, and sometimes political operatives. Unlike monks who lived in silence, Jesuits were active in the world. They built schools, advised kings, and traveled across oceans. They became teachers to the children of emperors and confessors to powerful rulers. This gave them direct access to the ears and minds of the world's most powerful people. By the early 1600s, they had schools and missions on every continent except Antarctica. From the courts of China to the forests of Paraguay, Jesuits embedded themselves into foreign cultures, often learning local languages fluently and studying local beliefs in order to better convert or control. In some regions, they adapted their teachings to local customs so effectively that even emperors allowed them to stay when other missionaries were banned. In other places, they created entirely new systems of control, organizing native populations under Christian governance while protecting them from colonial violence. Or so it appeared on the surface. But their growing influence didn't come without resistance. Jesuits were not loved by all. In fact, many feared them. Governments began to suspect their loyalty not just to the Pope but to something larger, a kind of international invisible network that operated across borders, above laws, and beneath the surface of public institutions. Rumors spread that they were behind assassinations, revolts, and power plays. Some of those rumors were propaganda, others had more substance. In France, they were accused of playing both sides of political conflicts. In England, they were seen as spies for Rome. In Japan, their influence grew so rapidly in the late 1500s that the ruling shogunate expelled them and executed converts. In Portugal and Spain, their deep ties to royal courts gave them immense power, until they were seen as too powerful. Eventually, in 1773, under pressure from European monarchs, Pope Clement XIV issued a decree that officially dissolved the Jesuit order. But the story didn't end there. Even after their official suppression, the Jesuits never fully disappeared. In many places, they continued their work underground. In others, they simply changed their appearance, working through allies or front institutions. Their colleges stayed open under different names. Their influence in education, especially among the elite, remained quietly intact, and within 40 years they were officially restored by the Vatican. But in that time they had already learned how to operate without visibility. That ability to adapt, to reorganize, to embed themselves again and again in different systems is part of what made the Jesuits so effective and so mysterious. They were never just missionaries. They were scientists, astronomers, cartographers, architects. They mapped entire regions of South America before colonial armies ever arrived. They trained local leaders who would later influence revolutions and reforms. They gathered intelligence on local economies, customs, and even military movements, all while presenting themselves as humble servants of God. In the 19th century, Jesuit influence expanded into new areas. They began building strongholds in North America, establishing elite schools and universities across the United States. Georgetown University, Boston College, Fordham, and dozens of others became gateways for influence in business, law, and politics. These weren't just religious institutions. They were training grounds for the country's future leaders, and the values taught there, discipline, obedience, intellectual rigor, loyalty to institutional tradition, stayed with those students for life. Even presidents, senators, generals, and intelligence directors have been shaped by Jesuit education. This isn't a theory, it's public record. Over time, people trained by the Jesuits found their way into the heart of national decision-making, not always acting on behalf of the order, but always shaped by it. Their presence also remained strong in Latin America, where Jesuit priests sometimes led social justice movements, but also played complex roles in regimes and rebellions. Some Jesuits sided with liberation theology, supporting the poor and resisting authoritarian power. Others quietly supported conservative regimes that protected the church. This dual role, resisting and reinforcing power, made it difficult to know where the orders stood, and that ambiguity was no accident. Jesuit strategy was always built on long-term thinking. They used layered communication, symbolic language, coded references, not only in their spiritual exercises, but in how they passed knowledge. Only trusted insiders were allowed full access. Initiation into Jesuit ranks required intense vetting. Candidates were studied, tested, observed, often for years before being fully accepted. They trained in philosophy, rhetoric, languages, and theology. But more than that, they were trained in discipline, mental discipline, strategic silence, and unwavering loyalty to the order. Their internal structures were like a military. There was a chain of command, regular reporting, and absolute obedience to leadership, and yet outwardly they appeared humble, detached from politics, focused only on service. This contrast between inner structure and outer appearance is what made them so difficult to trace. The Jesuits also maintained influence through the written word. They produced massive amounts of literature, theological treatises, philosophical arguments, historical records, and scientific observations. Some of these were public, but others circulated in limited circles, rare books, private letters, restricted archives. Ideas passed from teacher to student, carefully curated. Much of their most powerful thinking was never printed in mass. All the assurance. It was shared, discussed, and absorbed in private meetings. And in those meetings, something deeper was often taking place. Jesuit teaching was not just academic, it was spiritual, psychological, strategic. They trained people to question others but not themselves, to be deeply critical of outside ideas while protecting internal assumptions. This method gave them the ability to debate, to lead, and to defend their positions under pressure. It also created loyalty, not just to faith, but to the identity that came with being part of the inner group. Over time, their influence reached banking, military advisory roles, colonial planning, and even early intelligence structures, not because they advertised power, but because they positioned themselves where power was already growing. They moved quietly, rarely in front, often behind the scenes, trusted advisors, skilled mediators, always learning. They didn't need to control the crown when they could whisper in the ear of the crown's confessor. One of the lesser-known stories involves the Jesuits' work in shaping the structure of secret diplomacy in Europe. They trained men who would go on to manage treaties, broker backroom deals, and operate across enemy lines. Their mastery of language and psychology made them ideal for this kind of work. They could switch roles, speak convincingly in different cultural settings, and influence outcomes without ever appearing responsible. In modern times, Jesuit influence has shifted form again. They are less visible as agents of the Vatican and more embedded in global education, social policy, and international think tanks, yet their core structure remains: silent hierarchy, deep loyalty, an inner doctrine rarely discussed with outsiders. Those trained within Jesuit systems often speak of a sense of higher duty, not always to religion, but to a kind of moral intelligence shaped by rigorous tradition. The Jesuits are not a myth, but the myth around them has helped obscure just how real their impact has been. Conspiracy theorists focus on the extremes: shadow governments, hidden banks, global manipulation. But the truth, while less dramatic, is often more unsettling. The Jesuits don't need to control everything. They only need to shape the people who do. This subtle influence is why they're still viewed with suspicion by many. They don't need to speak loudly. They don't need to appear often. The systems they've built, the minds they've shaped, and the institutions they've guided continue operating with or without them in the room. Their model of influence is based on depth, not visibility. Even within the Vatican, their position has always been unique. While many other orders have focused on charity, monastic life, or public preaching, the Jesuits have stayed focused on formation, shaping thought, language, and leadership. Their schools don't just teach religion, they teach law, economics, diplomacy. They have trained ambassadors, CEOs, advisors, and strategists, and many of those trained never wore the robes or took the vows, but still carried the marks of that formation. They use a layered method of teaching that reveals deeper ideas slowly, not all at once. Basic ideas are taught early, but the deeper frameworks are saved for those who've proven loyalty. It's not about hiding truth, it's about filtering it. They believe not everyone is ready for certain knowledge, and that belief, selective access to truth, has kept their structure tight, even as the world around them has changed. The symbols they use aren't just decorative. The IHS emblem, the three nails, the sunburst, these carry layered meanings. In public, they refer to Christian values. In private, they've also been used to mark levels of knowledge, roles within the order, and the movement of information. Their use of symbols is closer to code than art, simple at first glance, complex when studied. One of the more persistent mysteries has been their role in shaping responses to heresy and rebellion. While the Inquisition was run by different authorities, Jesuits often advised those in power on how to handle dissent, not with torture, but with persuasion. They were trained to win arguments, not with volume, but with precision. They believed if a person could be made to see the flaw in their logic, they could be brought back into obedience, and if not, their isolation could be quietly arranged. They didn't always succeed, but even their failures taught them how people resist power. That knowledge was stored, shared, and refined over time. Some of the psychological insights developed in Jesuit schools later became the foundation for broader tools of persuasion, used in education, politics, and even corporate strategy. Their reach was never only vertical, it was lateral, across borders, across generations, across fields of knowledge, and always with one goal in mind: influence through formation. In the 20th century, Jesuits were active in parts of the world undergoing massive transformation. In newly independent nations, they often arrived early to set up schools, advise local governments, and shape educational policy. Their presence was seen as helpful by some, intrusive by others, but also frameworks of thought deeply tied to their worldview. That worldview was not always obvious. It didn't come with flags or orders, it came with assumptions, habits, and patterns of instruction. Jesuit missions in Africa and Asia often included training programs for local teachers and leaders. While the message was Christian, the method was strategic. Convert the mind first. Don't argue religion openly. Just build trust, offer education, and make your logic feel familiar. This approach worked more often than not. In many countries, some of the most respected schools are still Jesuit-run or Jesuit-influenced. Generations of political leaders, judges, and scholars were shaped by these systems. The Cold War added another layer. Jesuit institutions became sites of ideological training, especially in Latin America and Southeast Asia. While publicly neutral, Some Jesuits aligned with Western anti-communist efforts, while others aligned with local resistance. Again, their internal disagreements were not always visible from the outside, but internally there were deep debates about how involved they should be in politics, how far they could go in resistance, and what counted as loyalty to their mission. The question that follows them, even today, is how much influence is too much? When an order devoted to spiritual matters also helps shape education, diplomacy, and social theory, where is the line? The Jesuits have answered this in many ways over time, sometimes by retreating from politics, other times by stepping in when they felt the moral structure of a society was falling apart. They don't always agree within their own ranks, but their ability to remain active through wars, revolutions, and papal shifts shows a flexibility that most institutions can't match. Even when banned or expelled, as they were in multiple countries over centuries, they found ways to return, sometimes legally, sometimes through local allies, sometimes under new names but with the same methods. That kind of endurance doesn't happen by accident. It comes from planning, learning, and knowing when to speak and when to disappear. Their disappearances were never truly silent. In places where Jesuits were expelled, records show that their influence often lingered long after their departure. In some cases, local elites who had been educated by them stepped in to preserve their institutions. In others, the buildings they left behind were reoccupied by different religious or political groups. But the structures of thought remained: textbooks, curricula, ethical codes. A system that once shaped minds quietly kept doing so even after its original architects had gone. This continuity is part of what makes the Jesuits unique among secretive or semi-secret societies. Unlike most underground groups, they didn't rely on ritual secrecy or isolation. They operated in the open, yet stayed largely misunderstood. They didn't need to hide their presence, only their methods. Their power came not from controlling events, but from shaping the minds of those who would. In this way, they differ from groups like the Freemasons or the Rosicrucians. While those organizations often focused on symbolism, ceremony, and secret initiations, the Jesuits built their secrecy into the structure of education and discipline. They didn't need symbols to guard knowledge. They used intellectual hierarchy, levels of understanding, silent codes of trust. They didn't reveal everything to everyone, only those who had proven themselves. That approach kept their mission resilient even when everything around them changed. Governments rose and fell, wars redrew borders, ideologies clashed. But the Jesuits remained focused, not on who held office, but on who shaped the people who would. That's why their presence in education has always been central. It's not about religion on the surface. It's about control through shaping perception, through repeated exposure to certain texts, through debates framed in certain ways, through rewards for certain kinds of thinking. That's how they passed on their worldview, not by demanding belief, but by shaping what kind of beliefs felt logical. Even today, some of the most elite schools in the world follow the educational patterns first developed by Jesuit institutions. Long before modern pedagogy, Jesuits had already mapped the stages of learning, the importance of reflection, and the link between language and power. They understood how people internalize ideas, how narratives shape loyalty, how education becomes identity. As the modern world continues to change, the Jesuits remain active, but less visible. Their methods haven't disappeared, they've just adapted. In the digital age, they still run schools, publish ideas, shape minds. But now the tools are broader. Online education, public policy forums, global conferences. The format has changed, the intent has not. They still operate with the same internal structure, still prioritize loyalty, reflection, and formation, still emphasize the long view over immediate influence. That's why their legacy lasts. Not because they control outcomes directly, but because they shape the people who do, quietly, over time, patiently. Their story is not a story of conspiracy, it's a story of method, of formation over force, of control without visibility, and of a kind of power that doesn't announce itself, but prepares others to hold it. When we look at history, we often focus on battles, elections, and revolutions, but behind those moments are the people who shaped them. And behind many of those people, somewhere in their education or philosophy or inner world, was a quiet force shaping how they saw the world. For many centuries, that force was the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits built their influence not on wealth or violence, but on formation, the slow, deep shaping of minds, and that may be the most powerful kind of influence there is. Not because it controls outcomes directly, but because it shapes what people think is possible, and that is the hidden influence of the Jesuits.